Now let's talk about a technique that separates high scorers from everyone else. It's called pre-phrasing, and it's exactly what it sounds like. You predict the answer before you even look at the choices. Now, I know that might sound risky. You're thinking to yourself, wait, you want me to guess before I even read the answers? I'm not saying to guess, I'm saying to predict based on what the question is actually asking and what the logic demands. And when you do it right, you get faster, more confident, and you dodge tons of trap answers. Now, pre-phrasing is not about coming up with a perfect answer in your head. It's about having a general expectation of what a good answer would need to do before you go near the choices. Think of it like this. In a strengthing question, you expect something that fixes a weakness or fills a gap. In a flaw question, you're looking for the error in the reasoning. In a necessary assumption, you're expecting something that must be true or else the argument falls apart. You don't need to nail every word, you just gotta have a target. Now here's why pre-phrasing is a game changer. It gives your brain a filter. You're not walking in blind. You've got a clear idea of what to say yes to and what to ignore. It also makes wrong answers stand out. Once you know what you're looking for, you start spotting wrong answers way faster. And it saves time, especially on tough questions. Instead of reading all 5 choices with equal weight, you're scanning for the one that matches your prediction. And we train our students to build their prediction capabilities like a muscle, because it speeds up across the whole test, not just logical reasoning. So let's say you have an argument where the stimulus says, city council members who support environmental reform are more likely to win re-election. Then the question is, which one of the following would most weaken the argument above? Before you look at the choices, you ask, what would make that conclusion less convincing? So you might pre-phrase, maybe environmental reform isn't what helped them win, maybe it was something else. Now, when you scan the choices, you're looking for that idea. You're not falling for fluff like, some voters care about pollution. Now, to get better at pre-phrasing, you always want to pause before jumping to the choices. Seriously, don't be the person who finishes reading the stimulus and dives straight into the choices without thinking. You also want to say it in your own words. You don't want to try and sound like the LSAT, you just think you're say, they assumed X, or this argument needs Y, or this would weaken it if Z. And finally, don't panic if your prediction isn't in the answers. Your pre-phrase is meant to be a guide, not a trap. If the right answer says something similar in a different way, it still counts. Now, pre-phrasing is magic because when it works, it feels obvious. You get to the question, you read the stimulus, and your brain goes, oh, I know what they're doing here. Then you skim the choices and, boom, one of them jumps out. That's when you know you're starting to think like the test. Now, pre-phrasing isn't magic, it's just a mindset. It means you stop reacting and you start predicting. It puts you in control of the section instead of letting the LSAT lead you around by the nose. So start using it now. Even if your predictions are rough at first, that's fine. You're still building the skill. And the more you use it, the more the test will start to feel predictable in the best way possible. Now let's say you get stuck between 2 choices. You're squinting at both of them. One kind of sounds right, but the other one has a nice phrase in it, and now the clock's ticking. This is where most test takers go wrong. They try to pick the right answer by focusing on what sounds most correct. But top scorers do the opposite. They eliminate the wrong ones first. So even if they don't love the answer they pick, they know the others are worse. So let me show you how this works. Elimination flips the whole game. Instead of hunting for perfection, you're hunting for mistakes. And that's way easier. The LSAT is full of traps. Answers that are kinda right until you dig a little deeper. But wrong answers always have one thing in common. They fail the job the question is asking them to do. Once you know how to spot that, you'll stop falling for shiny language. Here is your 3-step system to eliminate like a pro. First, you've got to know what the question type wants. Every logical reasoning question has a job. Strengthen asks you to add support. Weaken asks you to break the link between evidence and conclusion. Flaw asks you to point out the error, and necessary assumption is something that must be true for the argument to work. So for each answer you ask, does this do the job? If not, it's gone. Then, step 2, look for scope shifts and new information. This is a huge red flag. If an answer brings in a brand new idea that wasn't in the stimulus, knock it out. For example, if the stimulus is about dog behavior and an answer choice suddenly talks about wolves, there's a decent chance it's probably wrong. And finally, don't fall for half right, half wrong. Some choices start off great, but then they crash and burn at the end. They'll say something helpful, then they'll add a random twist just enough to make it wrong. So you've got to read the whole thing. Even one little word can disqualify an answer. Now, if you're stuck between two choices, your job is not to choose the best, you're asking which one is worse. Literally try to eliminate both. Push them, challenge them, and usually one of them will crack under pressure. And if you truly can't decide, pick one and move on. There is no bonus point for agonizing over it. Now let's say you have a flaw question, for example, most people who eat carrots are healthy, therefore eating carrots makes you healthy. Classic correlation causation flaw. Now you see the following answers. A says, the argument confuses a correlation with a causal relationship. B says, the argument fails to consider that some people eat carrots and remain unhealthy. Now, which one is better? Answer choice A nails the flaw. Answer choice B sounds reasonable, but it doesn't actually explain what the argument did wrong. So even if B feels tempting, you eliminate it. That is elimination strategy at work. So if you want to score in the 170s, stop looking for the perfect answer. Start eliminating the bad ones. They are all over the place. And once you get good at spotting them, logical reasoning gets way easier. So from now on, your job is not to be the nicest person at the party, it's to be the bouncer. If an answer doesn't meet the standard, kick it out. Now let's talk about how the LSAT tricks people. Not with hard logic, but with sneaky language. They don't just test your reasoning, they test whether you can stay focused when the wording gets kind of weird. So I'm going to show you the most common LSAT language traps and how to dodge them every time. This is not just about vocabulary, it's about learning to think precisely even when the test is trying to trip you up. The first big trap is absolutes versus qualifiers, and this one shows up all the time. I'm talking about words like always, never, must, and cannot. These words are absolute. They leave no wiggle room, and that makes them risky, especially in answer choices. Now compare them with words like some, often, can, and may. These are qualified. They allow for exceptions, and on the LSAT, they're usually safer, especially when the stimulus itself is vague or nuanced. So here's the rule. When in doubt, watch for extreme language. If the stimulus didn't say always, don't pick a choice that does. The second big trap is words like some, most, and all. The LSAT loves playing numbers games with vague quantifiers. So let's break it down. Some means at least one. That's it. It could be one person out of 100. Most means more than half or a majority. And all means 100%, no exceptions. So if a stimulus says some dogs bark and the answer says most dogs bark, it's probably a trap. Most is stronger than some. Don't fall for it. Only pick stronger language if the stimulus supports it. Now, the third trap I want to share with you is cause for versus is associated with. This is a subtle but powerful distinction. A cause means that one thing directly leads to another or is responsible for another. Associated with means two things happen together, but there might be no causal link. So if a stimulus says high coffee intake is associated with anxiety, and the answer says coffee causes anxiety, that's a big red flag. It's a classic correlation causation jump. But if the stimulus doesn't prove a causal link, you don't want to pick an answer that claims one. The fourth trap is changing terms without warning. Sometimes the LSAT will pull a fast one by substituting a word halfway through. So if the stimulus says all professional athletes must train daily, and the answer says anyone who plays sports must train daily, you got to slow it down. Playing sports and being a professional athlete are not the same thing. That is a scope shift, and it makes the answer wrong. You always want to double check whether the terms match exactly, because the LSAT loves to get lazy, or sneaky depending on how you look at it, with the synonyms and see if you notice. And so for our students, we're always highlighting mismatched terms. That makes it a lot easier to catch those traps. Now, the fifth trap I want to share with you is unclear references. You'll sometimes see choices with vague pronouns, like this supports the argument or that weakens the assumption. You got to ask, what is this and what is that? If it's not clear what the word refers to, you've got to be suspicious because the LSAT loves to hide answers behind bad writing. Now, if you're ever reading an answer and you think to yourself, wait, what did I just read? That is a sign to slow down. Rephrase it in your own words and strip away the fluff. Sometimes the LSAT makes wrong answers sound fancy just to confuse you. But when you put it in plain English, the bad logic becomes obvious. Now let's talk about those lengthy logical reasoning questions where the stimulus is like 10 lines long, packed with jargon, and you feel like you need a nap halfway through. The ones that look more like reading comp than logical reasoning, those parallels for example, they will make a lot of students panic and think, this has got to be harder. But the truth is, just because it's long doesn't mean it's hard. It just means you need a better approach. The first big trap with these is trying to memorize the entire thing. That is where most students go wrong. They'll see a long stimulus and think they've got to remember every single detail. But the LSAT doesn't reward memory, it rewards structure. So instead of trying to memorize all the names, the dates, and the scientific terminology, look for the main point, the logic, and the flow of the argument. Who said what, what's the conclusion, and how did they try to prove it? That's it. And if we're dealing with multiple paragraphs, like in logical reasoning, pay attention to what each one is doing. It might be something like paragraph 1 introduces a theory, paragraph 2 challenges it with new data, and paragraph 3 offers an alternative explanation. If you treat each paragraph like it has a job, you'll stop getting lost in the weeds. Now, a lot of long passages sound technical just to throw you off. And so if the sentence is confusing, rephrase it in your own words, break it down, simplify it like you were going to explain it to a 5-year-old. Because the LSAT, of course, is not testing your scientific knowledge, it's testing your ability to follow an argument through tricky language. After you read the stimulus, the argument, and logical reasoning, especially when it's long, you want to look at the question stem and ask, what part of this passage actually matters? If the question's about the main point, you don't want to sweat every single little detail. If it's a weakened question, focus on the author's reasoning, not the background. The question stem helps you narrow your attention so you're not trying to hold everything in your head. Now, for the longer logical reasoning questions, don't be afraid to mark the conclusion, any shifts in the argument, any weird words or definitions. Even just circling 1 or 2 phrases can help you keep your grounding. And so for this reason, we tell our students, it's not about how much you underline, it's about underlining the right things. These long arguments don't have to be your enemy. They're just regular arguments with more decoration. So don't let their length psych you out. Focus on the structure, use the question stem to narrow in, and don't be afraid to rewrite confusing sentences in your own words. Once you build this muscle, you're going to start to love the longer logical reasoning passages because most people avoid them, which means free points for you. Now, let's suppose you're cruising through logical reasoning, and then you hit one of those questions with no real world topic, no clear facts, just vague terms like a justification for a general principle, a prescriptive claim, or an abstract standard of fairness. So in these cases, your brain immediately goes, what are they even talking about? Totally normal reaction. And most people hate these questions. But the good news is you don't need a philosophy degree to crush them. You just need a strategy. Now, abstract logical reasoning questions feel hard because they sound hard. But behind the fancy words is usually a very basic idea. Your first move should be to zoom out and ask, what is the author trying to argue? What is this really about? You're not looking for deep insight here. You're just trying to anchor yourself in the argument, because even abstract arguments still have premises and conclusions. So the first thing you want to do is rewrite the entire thing in plain English. Obviously, don't do that on test day, but do it during your review. So let's say the stimulus said, for example, quote, any policy that restricts autonomy without demonstrable benefit is unjustifiable. Let's simplify it. If a rule limits freedom and doesn't help anybody, it's a bad rule. Much easier. You are allowed, encouraged even, to rephrase abstract ideas in your own words. That's how you stop feeling lost. And with abstract questions, as always, the topic doesn't really matter at all. What matters is the structure of the argument. So if the stimulus says, quote, an action is morally wrong if it disrespects human dignity, since lying disrespects dignity, it's wrong. You don't need to debate the ethics of lying here. You've just got to see the form. The rule says if A requires B, fact A, conclusion B. That is clean, clear logic, just wrapped up in big words. We have the conditional, we have the sufficient condition activating that, then we have the necessary automatically following. So you want to slow down and ask, does this answer match the structure of the argument? Is it making the same kind of argument or something slightly different? And remember, if the stimulus is abstract, the right answer will usually mirror that level of abstraction. So don't pick something that suddenly talks about a specific scenario unless the question tells you to. And of course, the more you practice these abstract questions, especially parallel reasoning and principal application, the more comfortable you're going to get. And you'll start to realize it's just pattern recognition. So for our students, we typically strip away the content entirely and just use variables so they can focus on the shape of the argument. If you do that enough times, even the scary abstract questions turn into free, easy points. Now, abstract logical reasoning, like anything on the LSAT, is all about pattern recognition. You translate and you stay calm under pressure. You don't run, you don't freeze, you just translate and look for structure. Now, let's talk about the big picture issue a lot of students face, which is mixing up different kinds of questions. So let's step back and compare them side by side. Every single one of these question types in logical reasoning is about evaluating arguments. That means the stimulus contains a conclusion and premises that try to support it. And your job is to ask, does this argument actually make sense? That is the starting point for every single assumption family question. Before anything else, ID the conclusion. That is your anchor. Now, one of the big types that trip people up is necessary assumption versus sufficient assumption. So let's break it down. Necessary assumption questions are asking you for something that must be true in order for the argument to work. Meaning, if this isn't true, the whole thing falls apart. That's why you want to use the negation test. In contrast, for sufficient assumption questions, you want something new that, if true, would guarantee the conclusion. Think to yourself, if this is true, the conclusion follows 100%. These are often much stronger and often more specific. The key difference is that necessary assumption questions are all about holding the argument together. Sufficient is about proving the conclusion. So the problem is, if you pick a sufficient answer on a necessary question, what you've chosen is too strong. If you pick a necessary answer on a sufficient question, it's not strong enough. That's why people get confused. Now, another common mistake is strengthen versus weaken, mixing those up. These are, of course, more intuitive, but still easy to confuse in the moment. For a strengthener, you want to make the argument more convincing. For a weakener, you want to make the argument less convincing. You're not proving or disproving anything, you're just adding or removing support. And by the way, if the argument's weak, a strengthened answer will often fill a gap. If the argument's strong, a weakened answer will often show a hidden flaw. So you've got to understand where the argument is vulnerable, and then see which answer addresses that spot. Now, flaw questions are a little different. Instead of asking you to help or hurt the argument, they ask you to name the error in the reasoning. It's like being a coach reviewing a bad play. You're asking, what went wrong here? So the focus isn't on changing the argument, it's on diagnosing the problem. That's why so many flaw answers use phrases like confuses, fails to consider, or presumes without justification. Now, evaluate questions are kind of an oddball. They ask, which one of the following would be most helpful to know in assessing the argument? In other words, what question could you ask that would test whether the argument is strong or weak? You're not strengthening or weakening yet. You're deciding what info would help you decide. That's a subtle shift, but a huge one. It's like saying, Before I give an opinion, I need more data, and here's the data I would want. Now let's talk about principal strengthening questions. These work just like regular strengthen, but the correct answer is more abstract. It's a rule that supports the argument. As for parallel flaw, it's just like parallel reasoning, but you're matching bad logic, not good logic. So if the argument makes a correlation causation error, so too should the correct answer. As always, it's not about the topic, it's about the type of mistake. Now let's shift gears and talk about the inference family of questions. These will feel different from assumption family, of course, because the stimulus is not necessarily an argument. No conclusion, no reasoning to evaluate, just facts. And your job is to read those facts carefully, then figure out what must logically follow. But even within this family, you've got three common types that love to mess with people. You've got must be true, most strongly supported, and cannot be true. So let's talk about how these are different from each other and how to avoid getting tricked. Must be true is the gold standard. It's the strictest question type. You're looking for something that is 100% guaranteed to be true based only on what's stated in the stimulus. Not probably true, not feels true, must be true. That means no outside knowledge, no assumptions, no maybe language. If it's not directly supported by the facts, it's out. And the wrong answers here will often sound tempting, but they add new info or they overreach. So you want to stick to what's actually said. Now, most strongly supported is still close, but a bit softer. You still want something that is supported by the passage, but it doesn't have to be ironclad. It's just got to be the best supported choice, even if it's not airtight. The key difference is must be true requires 100% certainty, and most strongly supported is probably true based on the facts. So the right answer might not be directly stated, but it flows naturally from what is. Now, cannot be true flips the script. Instead of looking for what's supported, you're looking for the thing that violates the information in the stimulus. If the stimulus says all cats are mammals and the answer says some cats are not mammals, that is cannot be true. These questions are testing whether you can spot logical contradictions. So you want to look for choices that look neutral, but actually break the rules. Cannot be true answers often look innocent until you realize they flat out disagree with the facts. Now, for all inference questions, you want to make sure you read carefully because these are detail based. You don't need to analyze structure, but you do need to be precise. You also don't want to predict too much because these are not about filling the gap like in assumption questions. You want to stay close to the actual text. You also want to eliminate aggressively. Wrong answers often overreach. If it goes even one step beyond the facts, you want to cut it out. Also, look for quantifiers. Words like some, all, many, must, likely, and can change everything. So make sure that you don't ignore them. It's all about careful reading. So slow down, be methodical, and don't let the LSAT sneak in new ideas disguised as common sense. If it wasn't in the stimulus, it's not your friend. Now, let's talk about parallel versus parallel flaw questions. These two types confuse a lot of students, and I get it. They both start off the same way. They ask, which one of the following most closely parallels the reasoning above? And they both give you long, dense answer choices that feel like mini stimuli. But the difference is, parallel reasoning is asking you to match the argument regardless of validity. Parallel flaw tells you that you're matching a flawed or bad argument. Same format, slightly different goal. So let's break down how to tell them apart and how to beat both of them. But first, you got to know what the question's even asking. Check the question stem. Look for keywords like flawed reasoning, erroneous reasoning, or parallels the flawed reasoning above. If you see that language, you're doing parallel flaw. If the question just says parallels the reasoning above, with no judgment, it's regular parallel reasoning. With parallel reasoning, you're matching structure and validity. With parallel flaw, you're matching structure and the error. If you don't notice the distinction, you might get wrecked by trap answers. Now, the first thing you want to do is boil the argument down to its skeleton. That is the most important step for both of these types. You cannot just skim. You've got to strip it down to its core logic. First, you ID the conclusion and the premises. Then you rephrase them in abstract terms. And finally, you want to note whether the argument is flawed or valid. For example, if they said all cats are animals, Fluffy is a cat, therefore Fluffy is an animal, the structure would be all A's are B's, X is A, therefore X is B. That is valid logic. So for a parallel reasoning question, you want another answer with that exact form. In contrast, we have parallel flaw. For example, all surgeons are doctors, Bob is a doctor, therefore Bob is a surgeon. Might look similar, but this one is flawed, classic reversal. The structure here would be all A's are B's, X is B, therefore X is A. Incorrect, invalid, flawed. So for parallel flaw, you want another argument that makes the same kind of mistake. Now here's the big trap. A lot of wrong answers on the LSAT will match the topic, but not the logic. If the stimulus is about dogs, they'll give you choices about cats, horses, maybe even squirrels. Doesn't matter. You're not matching the topic, you're matching the structure. Once you find answers with the same structure, then you want to check to see, is the logic valid or is the same flaw repeated? That's what you want to look for. And for parallel flaws, they love to repeat the same old greatest hits like correlation causation, necessary sufficient confusion, circular reasoning, and scope shifts. So if you spot a familiar flaw in the stimulus, you want to label it right away. That'll help you find the matching flaw faster in the answer choices. Now, I know that these two parallels both seem intimidating, but they're actually quite mechanical. You strip down the stimulus, match the structure, and double check for the logic, whether it's valid or flawed. It's like matching blueprints rather than painting a picture. And once you get the hang of it, these questions become predictable, and sometimes they can even be fun. Yes, really. Now let's get back into logical reasoning. I wanted to share some thoughts about strengthened versus sufficient assumption questions. Really common struggle where students can't tell the difference between the two or what they're asking for. Now, the difference between these two types is huge, but mixing them up leads to wrong answers and wasted time. So strengthened versus sufficient assumption. If the question says, which one of the following, if true, most strengthens the argument, that is naturally a strengthened question. But if it says, which one of the following, if assumed, allows the conclusion to be properly drawn, that is a sufficient assumption. That means you are looking for an answer that guarantees the conclusion. Strengthen helps the argument, sufficient proves the argument. So you want to imagine the argument like a bridge. In a strengthened question, the bridge might exist, but it has some cracks, and your job is to patch it up and make it stronger. In a sufficient assumption question, the bridge is missing, and your job is to build a brand new support that connects the premises to the conclusion 100%. So in strengthened questions, the correct answer might be strong or it might be subtle, and you're adding support, not guaranteeing. In a sufficient assumption question, the correct answer is usually very strong, and it logically forces the conclusion to follow. Now, here's where people get tricked. The LSAT loves to throw strengthened style answers into sufficient assumption questions and vice versa. So you'll see answers that make the argument better, but don't fully prove it. And they'll be tempting, but they'll be wrong. So your rule here is in sufficient assumption questions, if it doesn't guarantee the conclusion, it's out, you eliminate it. In a strengthened question, if it doesn't help at all, it's out, but the help can be small or big. So let's suppose we had an example, an argument where they say, all professional musicians practice daily. Lisa is a professional musician, therefore Lisa plays piano. Now, a strengthened answer might say, most professional musicians play piano, and that helps. It makes the conclusion more plausible. A sufficient answer would have to say, all professional musicians play piano. That guarantees the conclusion, and so Lisa must play piano. Really important difference here. Now, another classic LSAT trap is when students get confused between weakened questions and flaw questions, because both deal with bad arguments and they both want you to see the problem. But your job on each one is totally different. And if you mix them up, you'll either try to destroy something that's already broken or miss the chance to attack when you're supposed to. Now, you always want to start with the question stem. Weakened questions will say things like, which one of the following, if true, most seriously undermines the argument? In contrast, a flaw question will say something like, the reasoning in the argument is most vulnerable to criticism on the grounds that, yada yada. So in weaken, you're adding something new that makes the argument worse. In a flaw question, you are identifying something that is already wrong with it. So in weakened questions, you are actively sabotaging the argument. And in flaw questions, you are more passively diagnosing a problem with the argument. So think of it like in a flaw question, you are a movie critic pointing out what is wrong with the film. But in a weakened question, you're like a hacker who's trying to break a system. That's why the right answer in a flaw question will usually name the error, like assumes causation from correlation, or confuses necessary and sufficient conditions, or fails to consider an alternative explanation. Whereas for a weakened question, they are introducing new information that casts doubt on the argument. Now, in a flaw question, the stimulus is already fundamentally flawed in some way. Your job is just to spot how. But in a weakened question, the argument might look solid until you come in and drop a new fact that ruins it or hurts it. So for flaw questions, you want to ask, what is the logical mistake here? For a weakened question, you're asking, what could I say that would make this argument fall apart? Totally different mindset. Now, here is your quick summary. Again, once again, weakened questions, you are a saboteur, where you are adding new information that makes the argument worse. For a flaw question, you are diagnosing and you're pointing out what is already logically broken. So remember, in weakened, you are attacking. In flaw, you are analyzing. Now, let's talk about pacing and logical reasoning. In logical reasoning, you have about 25, 26 questions, and the timing is a huge factor because the LSAT is as much a test of strategy as it is of intelligence. So I'm going to give you a pacing framework that works whether you're aiming for a 165 or a 175. Now, note that you've got 35 minutes under standard time constraints, about 1 minute and 24 seconds per question on average. But you should not spend the same amount of time on every single question. You want to use a tiered approach. For the first 10 questions, you want to aim to solve them in roughly 10 minutes because they are generally easier and they get harder as the section goes on. For the mid-difficulty questions, maybe closer to 1:45. For the hardest, maybe close to 2 minutes. You bank time on the easier ones to save for the harder ones later that truly need it. So going faster on the early questions will help you go slower later when it truly counts. Far too many students get bogged down being perfectionists on the easy questions, then they have no choice but to rush towards the end where every second matters. So instead, don't do that. Move quickly and confidently through those first 10 questions, flag anything that feels sticky, keep going, and circle back to those tough questions later. Now, note that after the first 10 minutes, you want to be at about roughly question number 10. After 20 minutes, you're around roughly question 15, 16, 17, and you have the remaining time for the hardest questions later in this section. And remember that no single question is worth more than any other. They're all worth the same one raw score point. So if you feel like you're spending 3 minutes on a single question and you're not making any headway, you don't have a confident answer, I want you to just let it go. Mark it, guess if you need to, move on, circle back. You can always come back later, but don't sacrifice 3 other questions just to maybe win a stubborn tough one. Now, pacing is a skill that needs practice, and that's why we have our students do at least 10 full exams before test day. So test day itself feels like just another run through, and you've already worked out all your pacing issues. You have that internal sense of rhythm. So for now, if you want to use a timer, totally fine. I find that far too many students will get stuck in the drilling phase of their prep for far too long. I want you to, at some point, especially if you're taking it in November, but also for those of you taking January, I want you to think about moving on from the drilling, doing more pacing work under timed conditions, individual sections, and full-length exams, because it's not enough to get the questions right in isolation. You got to get them right under test day conditions, considering the time constraint, considering that students will have to learn to let go. It's far too easy to be a perfectionist and want to get every single question right. But if getting bogged down on question 15 for 4 minutes costs you the last 5 questions of the section, not a good trade, not worth it. If you find that you are consistently running out of time, you've got to fix the underlying problems, like reading slowly, like being too indecisive, or being unclear on common question types. There is space to learn all of that, but you've got to know when to push and when to let go. And flagging and skipping is a huge benefit. I think it is wonderful that LSAT has built a flagging function into the online LSAT because skipping is a strategy. Top scorers don't answer every single question in order. They don't get stuck. They make fast decisions about what's worth their time and what's not. The LSAT does not reward you for being stubborn. It rewards you for getting as many questions right as possible within that 35-minute time constraint. So if you hit a question that feels like a trap or a time sink, don't fight it. Flag it, move on, come back later when there's time. Now, of course, you don't need to skip every single question that's hard, but as a general rule, you might want to skip if you've spent 90 seconds and still have no clue, if you can't find the conclusion, if you can't eliminate anything, if you can't even articulate what they're asking, that is your cue to bail and flag it, come back later. But in contrast, if you understand the argument and you're just debating between two answers, it's worth staying on to finish it off. Now, again, when I talk about flagging, I'm not saying to flag 5, 10 questions or every single question that you're getting stuck on or having trouble with. Flag it only if you realistically think it's worth coming back to later. If you know what it's asking, if you're able to eliminate a couple answers and you feel like a new, fresh perspective might help you crack it later, then flag it, skip it, come back later. Otherwise, just choose something and move on. Now, let's say you've got roughly 4 minutes left. You've completed this section and you have a couple of flagged questions. You want to think about which ones you should tackle first. I would start with those where you've already eliminated a couple of choices because your odds are higher on those. Then secondly, once you've done those, move on to the ones that you kind of understand, but maybe you didn't have enough time in the moment. And finally, save the ones for last where you just had no clue and you were feeling kind of desperate. You might want to circle back to those and hope that a new look might give you a fresh perspective. Maybe you can make a more informed guess with a new look at it. But don't go back to those where you felt like you were totally at a loss and had no clue and it was like making your brain melt, because you might still get stuck in quicksand on those and it's just not worth it. And if you're noticing trends in what you are inclined to flag or what you are inclined to have no clue on, that's worth drilling on the side. Don't sacrifice it entirely. I mean, we're not at test day yet, right? So you've still got time to hopefully drill questions you're stuck on, questions you're not sure of, like the parallel reasoning questions, anything overly technical, science, philosophy, anything abstract in nature. You might want to drill those. And if your test is only a few weeks away, it might not be worth drilling those specifically. Maybe you want to work more on just the highest yield areas, like the more common logical reasoning types, specifically necessary assumption, inference, and flaw. But if you've already locked all of those down, you're at, say, 170 plus already, and you really want the 180, then in that case, of course, go for the parallels. Go for the technical science ones, for example. You don't want to leave any points on the table. Now, let's talk about what to do when you're stuck between two choices, where you've read the question, you've knocked out 3 answers, and you're down to 2. And you're sitting there rereading, second guessing, changing your mind. And you've got to remember that one of them is objectively wrong, the other is objectively right. When they say, which one of the following most weakens or most strengthens, that's a way for them to cover themselves. Typically, you're going to find that for a weakened question, only one choice actually weakens, the other 4 do not. For a strengthened question, one choice strengthens, the other 4 do not. There is always an objectively single right answer. The first step to break the tie between two is to first restate the conclusion and the evidence. Go back to the argument. What are they actually saying? The conclusion is X, the support is Y. Then you want to make sure that you are crystal clear on the question type. Is it necessary assumption? Is it weaken? Is it flaw? Is it inference? Articulate the question type, because that determines what the correct answer should say. Then you go back to your 2 contenders and you ask, does this answer actually do what this question type demands? If it's a weakened question, does this answer introduce a fact that makes the conclusion less likely? If it's an inference question, is the answer directly supported by the stimulus, or is it going too far? Now, if both of them seem kind of right, it means you don't fully understand the question yet. So you want to go back to the conclusion. If you're changing your answer multiple times, if you're waffling back and forth, you want to make sure you can stick with the one that better matches the reasoning of the argument. If you're seeing new language that appeals to you, remember that it's all about function. What role does this choice play in relation to the argument? When we consider the question type, when we look at the question type from that proper perspective, what impact does this choice have in terms of affecting the argument? And if you're still unsure, always make a choice based on logic. Flag it if you have to, move on, come back later. Don't let one question ruin your rhythm. Every section will have a few questions that might not click for you, and that's okay, even for top scorers. But what top scorers do differently is they don't get bogged down, they don't get stuck, they don't spiral. They recognize that even if they don't understand a particular question, it doesn't have to tank the whole exam. You can still get a top score getting a question wrong here or there. The raw score conversion charts will prove this for you. Now, let's talk about test anxiety and having a foggy brain. Because when you feel pressure and you read a sentence and you have no idea what it just said, it's part of the mental game. And with the test coming up, we want to help you prepare for that mental game and protect your brain, protect your emotions, your mindset when it matters most. And test day anxiety is not random. It's your brain freaking out and overanalyzing everything. So you got to have a pre-test ritual in place that grounds you. Now, part of that is waking up early so you're not rushing the day of the test. You want to do something physical, like going for a walk, stretching, doing a short workout. You want to eat something familiar, nothing new on test day, and review one thing you've mastered as a warm-up to help you build up your confidence. Maybe you want to listen to music, meditate, you breathe, whatever calms your system to prime your brain to show up under pressure when it truly matters. And if during the test you're 12 questions in and you have no idea what you're reading, remember that 5-second reset. Close your eyes, you breathe in, you breathe out, and you tell yourself, next question, fresh mindset. If you're feeling stuck, flag it, move on, come back later when you're mentally sharper. Don't fight an uphill battle. And repeat to yourself, one question at a time. I know how to do this. The answer is in the argument. Make those your mantras for when you're spiraling, when you're getting stuck. If you're hitting a rough patch, don't spiral, just let it go. One question will not define the section or the entire exam. You want to recenter, sit tall, breathe, and reset your internal clock and focus on nailing the next question. Your goal is not to be perfect, it's to recover quickly and maintain your pacing. And the pressure on test day is real. A foggy brain is real, but it doesn't have to be a surprise. That's why in the lead up to the test, especially in the final weeks, full sections under realistic pressure, simulating test day, and managing your mindset. That alone can make the difference between a 165 and a 175.